So, one of the criticisms that Patricia touched on this morning, but I certainly hear from time to time, of market systems approaches is that our field is, and this, one of the criticisms I hear from economists particularly, is that our field is too parochial. You know, we spend too much time talking about livestock vaccinations or fertilizer markets and not enough time talking about transformative economic change that's going to lift millions of people out of poverty. Now, I think Jim mentioned this morning there's been a resurgence of interest in industrial policy, which I think is, in a sense, a response to that policy ambition to be doing something really major. But I think it's worth us addressing this this question, this criticism. And I've got a panel here who are very well placed to do that. Because what they're going to talk about is what actually drives industries to become resilient, inclusive, and competitive. Is it industrial policy, big government, the involvement of big investors, or is it something else? Is it something coming from the grassroots and coming from the bottom up? And that's what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. The person who's going to host that discussion is very well qualified to do that. Soji Apampa is the country director for the Business Innovation Facility in Nigeria. But he's actually got a lot of experience of working with the private sector and with government. Soji.
Thank you very much, Mike. You're welcome back after lunch. And the big question, well, we have two questions that have been put down by Mike. We're going to have two people try to do justice to the issue. First, to my right is James Foster. He's a director of Africa programs for Gatsby. He's overseen their work in Tanzanian cotton and textile sectors. He had 10 years working experience in East Africa before joining the Gatsby Foundation. And to his right, we also have Stuart. Stuart Worsley has worked for 30 years in international development. Recently, he co-authored a book with Danny Burns of IDS titled Navigating Complexity in International Development. So both of them are going to spend some time discussing the topic. But I think we should start from James. The big question is transformative economic change possible at scale without a negotiated involvement of certain institutional stakeholders, like governments, like government funding agencies, like getting elite buy-in? Over to you, James.
Thank you, Soji. Can everyone hear me? No. Can everyone hear me now? I have to apologize. My voice has been gone and it's now coming back slowly. So if I sound like Bob Dylan, I apologize. I won't sing. Before I get started, Soji has asked me to do a icebreaker or a warm-up because we're in the graveyard slot after lunch. So, as I lived for 10 years in East Africa, and no good East African conference is complete without a good clapping ritual, please will you all stand up and warm your hands up. So warm your hands up. We're going to create a thunderstorm for some rain for Zambians because the cotton sector needs it desperately. So I want you to start with one finger and tap your hand. You hear the little rain, pitter patter. Okay, 2 fingers. It's getting heavy. 3 fingers. Very nice. Whole hand. All right. And very good, thank you. So we've given some rain to the cotton crops. So I'm from Gatsby. Just to give you a brief introduction about Gatsby, it's a private foundation from David Sainsbury, ex-chairman of the supermarket chain, and then since then he was 10 years in government as the Minister of Science and Innovation. in the DTI. Gatsby's been involved in East Africa for 30 years, mainly focused on agricultural research and development, with a bit of work as well on SME development. In the last 7 or 8 years, we've evolved significantly to focus on sector development, what we're calling sector development, which is in effect market systems development in the language of today. So Gatsby has a sort of pretty strong commercial orientation, but also, with David Sainsbury's background in government, a strong reflection on the drivers of government and the need for governments to be involved in stimulating growth. We're a funder and an implementer, so we have our own cash. We can take a long-term and patient approach. We can be adaptive and flexible. And we focus actually solely on East Africa. So we only work in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. We work in cotton, textiles, forestry, tea, and now aquaculture. We also support an entity which we created in Kenya called Kenya Markets Trust, which works in 5 other sectors: dairy, livestock, inputs, water, and seed. So that's about Gatsby. But the main aim of today is to talk about the cotton sector and to draw some lessons from that. Unlike Stuart, who's going to talk after me, Gatsby doesn't have a long, successful portfolio of programs. We're at an early stage. And we've experienced a lot of challenges in that early stage. So I'm going to talk about some of those challenges and try to draw some lessons from them. First sort of lesson I'm going to try and draw out, which everyone knows in the room, is that markets do not function by themselves, anywhere. My voice is going. So, in some cases, markets might function for a little while independently or in isolation. But in fact, in all cases, at some point, they will face challenges and risks. Challenges to changes in demand or what have you. As a result, they need constant monitoring and they need to be maintained. I'll give an example of the Tanzanian and the Zambian cotton sectors. Secondly, to be successful in the long run, markets need to be competitive, they need to be inclusive, and they need to be resilient. We've all used those terms a lot, and at Gatsby we've got a specific meaning for what we mean by those terms, and I'll go through those. But resilience, I think, is the one that we'll focus on most. And thirdly, that there's a role for government. Whether we like it or not, government is critical to sector development, to market development, and to creating the conditions for market systems to work. So I'll start by talking about cotton. Briefly, I'm sure most of you have seen cotton growing in the ground, have tried working in cotton, or are at least aware of the crop itself. It's primarily a smallholder crop, at least in Africa. It's grown in relatively dry areas, so not the best growing conditions, and so therefore it's actually a pretty strong pro-poor crop. It's heavily susceptible to pests, so farmers in general need pesticides to deal with it. And while it's not a particularly high value crop, it's relatively drought tolerant, so farmers still plant it and like it. But they do generally need credit, and the standard system is that they get credit for their inputs, seed and pesticide, which is the norm. As it's non-perishable, cotton can be transported long distances, which means that even a ginnery or a cotton processing unit operating 100 kilometers from the cotton farmer can still buy its crop, which means that competition can be severe. At the same time, processing units for cotton can be very, very small, or they can be tens of millions of dollars. So you've got low barriers to entry. When we first started working in cotton in 2008 in Tanzania, the sector was effectively beautifully organized, or to all intents and purposes beautifully organized. You've got the structures in place that could make a sector really work and be dynamic. There are representative associations of farmers, representative associations of ginners. There's a regulatory board that oversaw the buying practices. There's an industry trust fund that takes a levy on the crop at the end of the season, which ginners and farmers jointly contribute to. And that levy funds seed and pesticides for the next season, but also collaborative research and even extension services. So those were the sort of structures that were in place. Despite that, the cotton sector was in crisis. The trust fund is bankrupt, effectively. Most ginners have not been forced to pay, or some of the ginners have not been forced to pay their contributions. The Research Institute has produced a good new seed, but it can't be commercialized. The government policy and regulatory environment on the seed multiplication system isn't working. And as a result, you don't have this seed being distributed or commercialized. Farmers receive almost no training in good agricultural practices. And as a result, the processors are selling low quality, adulterated cotton to international markets at a discount. Their throughput in the ginneries is on average around 25%, which is pretty shocking for their profitability. And the conversion ratio of seed cotton to lint is about 30% less than the East and Southern African average. So ginners are not making much profit, farmers are not getting good yields, and the sector is gradually dying. Despite this, the industry is not doing anything about it. It's just walking gradually into collapse. So since 2008, Gatsby's been working with the government to try and support the seed research side of things to get better seeds in there that would help both farmers and ginners. We've worked on good agricultural practices targeted to the lake zone to try and improve farmer productivity. We've created now a markets system for inputs, in fact, broader than cotton, in all crops. Working also on the sort of service provision for tractor services and so on. But the main thing we've been trying to do, which is the really crucial aspect of what will save the cotton sector, is to try and sort out the regulatory environment, working with the government. And this has involved trying to pilot models of contract farming, which have ginners providing support to farmers directly, rather than with funding coming in from the trust fund. And it's involved also working with local governments to sort of oversee those relationships, and working with national government to try and set the minimum criteria. As I'll show you when I undo this, this has been the production of seed cotton in Tanzania in recent years. As you can see, it's not particularly stable, to say the least. What you find is that in periods where there's been a very strong and successful institutional structure created, which was the initial one back in 2002-03, where they had a very good system of providing these inputs to ginners who would then pass them on to farmers, and it worked on an annual basis. It worked for a few years to deliver growth. What happened was the system got undermined, vested interests came in, started to undermine the actual relationship between the ginners and the farmers with side selling and side buying, and so the system collapsed. Again, you see a spike again in 2007 and 8 where the same situation happened. In 2010-11, when Gatsby first came on the scene, we were able to help create contract farming. We did a few pilots, it seemed to work. The government said, right, let's roll it out nationally. The pilots weren't really ready to go. They were pretty small scale. They were effective to some extent, but they weren't really testing the nitty-gritty of how things can work in practice. The government tried to roll it out. Huge spike in production because every farmer got inputs and more inputs than they've ever had before. But as a result, the interest in the sector, the political economy issues in the sector came back, and the ginners that were then asked to sort of start funding the inputs themselves decided that this was a bad idea. So again, the farmers' access to inputs has declined and continues to decline now to this day. So that's the situation. We have seen some progress in recent years where the ginners particularly, but also the farmers are willing to now fight a little bit for this seed system to start working. Because seed is an easy win. It supports the farmer's productivity, supports the ginner's productivity, and it supports the overall quality, which should result in a higher price. So everyone can see a direct and immediate benefit to seed working. But contract farming is tougher. You've got your entrenched interests in the sector, the ginners, and they're a mixed bag. Some of the ginners have a very long-term vision. They've invested $10 million or more in their ginneries, in their processing units, and they see the picture. They see that the cotton crop decline is going to kill them. It's going to kill their business, and they've got this massive asset that's underutilized. So they are trying to work with farmers, and we've been working with a number of them to try to drive models that can then be replicated elsewhere. The challenge is that on the other side of the fence you have a lot of very small ginners, very small operators, or even medium-scale operators, but who are not particularly financially solid. They probably don't have audited annual accounts, let's say, and they certainly don't really have access to sufficient working capital to put money into farmers at the start of the season, planting season that is, and recoup it 10 months later. As a result, they're very, very resistant to this change that the government and the rest of the stakeholders are keen to drive through. So we've been battling this for a few years now and trying to build coalitions of the willing, if you like, to support the change. But it's still proving very difficult, and it really comes down to whether the government is going to be willing to take tough decisions. The government's going to need to actually say, right, we're going to force this industry to adopt these minimum standards, these minimum requirements, and by doing so, we'll probably cut the size of the industry in terms of the number of ginners, but we'll make it less competitive, actually, and it will allow the ginners to therefore supply farmers with the inputs that they need. So the conclusion from Tanzania really is that we've been unable to effect change from a sort of gradual building of a cohort of people and a cohort of opinion around what needs to be done. But it really needs the government to buy into it, and we've got to get that change through the government. If I just go quickly onto Zambia to give you a sort of counterpoint, I've got explanations here on what's caused the change at the different times, but I won't go into those. And for Zambia, we have a similar story. Not quite so stark as Tanzania, perhaps, but probably even more disappointing in many respects. So in the late 90s, you had a big crash in the production of cotton in Zambia. Competition in the industry with new ginners coming in led to the fact that existing ginners could no longer supply inputs to farmers. Without inputs, farmers stopped planting cotton, grew maize or whatever instead, and the production crashed. Once the production crashed, some of the ginners left the industry. Those ginners that were left received quite a lot of international aid and support to boost this farmer supply systems again. So farmer support services with pesticides, with seed, with training, and with better collection systems, started to see an increase again in production. As the production increased, again you had interest from other ginners, other players re-entering the sector, coming back, or new ones starting. And again, the sector itself, without government support, was unable to constrain the side selling in these issues that are bound. And what you have is back down to a crash again. Very, very low production. The ginners' profitability is destroyed. Farmers receive probably a lower price, but also there are other factors going on with international prices and with the devaluation of the kwacha at the same time, and even obviously weather has a major play. But effectively, the support from the donors up to that period in 2007 had some impact, but then that impact has disappeared. And the same thing happened again up to 2011. Again, you see significant support with matching grant funding and so on of ginners in Zambia from international donors, leading to much greater supply of inputs and of seed and pesticide to farmers, and the crash again at the end. So this is the situation. It needs proper regulation of the industry, and unless you can get that regulation, you're in trouble. So for Gatsby, we've come to the conclusion that there are three key aspects that you need to see in any development program: competitiveness, inclusiveness, and resilience. And I'll focus just very, very briefly on resilience. The idea of resilience is that you've got a market system, you've got all the nested market systems around it. But if you look at that at the point at which some of these investments started in Zambia, it looked like it could sustain itself. It looked like by supporting into the industry is creating the services to farmers that are sustainable. In fact, that status quo of that competitive, inclusive system wasn't there. You need to also engage in the resilience of the system by working with the government, by working with the private sector and the actors to create stabilizers around the market system that will enable it to create the conditions for competitiveness, for inclusiveness into the long run. And this is one of the things that we've been struggling with, we've been grappling with in Tanzania. But it's that resilience, that sort of resilient structures, if you like, or the institutions that will be able to adapt in light of challenges, in light of risks and shocks to the system that we need to also address, which doesn't seem to be a strong feature of many market development programs and hasn't been until recently at Gatsby. So that's all I wanted to say. My voice is just held. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.